and unarmed resistance, political violence, and the development of civil society in authoritarian regimes. She's currently working on a book, probably coming out of her PhD. So this is on the emergence and consolidation of opposition to authoritarian rule. Timely, of course, given the events of the past few days. It looks at how opposition to autocratic regimes develops in the face of different patterns of state repression. We've got Regina Bateson, who is a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa and who's an old friend of mine from when we were both at Yale. Before she was at Ottawa, she did something quite amazing. She ran to become the congressional candidate in the 4th District in California. And before that, she was a professor at MIT in the political science department. And of course, she's also got a really interesting background as a foreign service officer in the US Department of State. So Gina's going to talk to us about armed groups and maybe when we can get her to talk a little bit about what it's like as a candidate. I've got Tereza Capelos, who is an associate professor in political psychology and director of the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security at the University of Birmingham. And she's also the president-elect of the International Society of Political Psychology. So Tereza is an absolute pro at talking about all things political psychology related, thinking about cognitive and motivational determinants of political judgments and decision making, thinking about surveys, experiments, media, and how political communication more broadly. And she's got a really interesting project on reactionism, and hopefully she'll get into some of that with us today. And then my dear friend, Colin Provost, who's at UCL. He is associate professor of public policy there, and he works on the courts. And he gave us a little bit of a taster of that last week. And I'm not sure that Colin's had much sleep these past few days with all of his media interviews on CNN and so forth, but we're very, very lucky to have him. He's going to be telling us, I think, all about both the electoral side of things, thinking about some of the methodologies and the discussions around polling, and also talking to us about the legal challenges and what the ramifications of those challenges might look like. So just to set the scene, I mean, right now, from the New York Times website, we've got 253 electoral votes for Biden, and we've got 214. There have been, some major data outlets that have called the election in favor of Biden, and I think, there's a lot of there's almost certainty that Biden is going to win this based on how things are falling out right now. But we're not quite there yet, but we're pretty close to there. So that's what the situation electorally looks like. But a whole bunch of other things have also happened in the past 24 hours. Colin has just accused me of doom tweeting for the past few days, but just to raise some of the issues that have come up and should be, I think, alarming to those of us who care about the preservation of democracy. We've had Donald Trump, of course, call the election a fraud. We've had lots of important people around him backing him up and saying that, even though they might not actually believe it, but key Republican leaders have come out and stood beside him, alongside him, and backed him up on this. We've had, various just kind of armed groups come out, or I should say armed protesters coming out and causing some concern around polling sites where polls are being where votes are being counted. We've had just a general sense of not knowing for a period, and people, if you look on social media and in various right-wing news outlets, being angry about the election being possibly stolen, in those words. So this idea of fraud, I think, is resonating quite strongly. We've got on Fox News, Newt Gingrich advising President Trump that Bill Barr should arrest election workers in Pennsylvania and then have the state legislature throw out the results of the election. just as yet another example. We have lawsuits all over the place, which we'll hear more about. So we've got a number of things that are in play and worrying. And I think there's some questions that come out of this, right? One is what comes next? What does this mean? Going back to last week's question, what does this mean for democratic norms both in America, and then thinking about how that resonates around the world? What does this mean for democracy? And thinking about that question about that slide into authoritarianism, and whether or not some of the things that we discussed last week should be of concern. And then this, you know, all of the lessons that have been learned, I think, over the past few days. We've seen the media, I think, mainstream media at least, being quite restrained about this conversation, which I think has been really, really heartening. People have been very cautious about calling states, and they've been very cautious about the language that is being used. So I think there are definitely some hopeful notes here. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it over to my fellow panelists. So the first person that's going to speak will be Colin, and then I've asked Consuelo to speak after that, and then Gina, and then Tereza. And I've just said, hey, you know, give us your reflections on the events for the past few days. I've asked them to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and I'll give them a little signal, you know, 5 minutes and 2 minutes left so that they will stay to time. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A. And I invite all of you at this point to put your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A. I'll look at both of them. Feel free to put in links to things that you've seen and that you think would be worthwhile discussing, or that other people might not be aware of. You know, there's been a lot that's been going on, so nobody knows about everything that has happened. So please feel free to share that in the chat, and feel free to respond to each other in the chat, and we will pick up on as many of the questions as you raise in the next, I guess, half an hour or so as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Colin.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everybody for being here on the second consecutive election Friday night. My goal, I guess, with what I'm going to talk about is to talk a little bit about the legal and the electoral context, where we are, what could happen with things like recounts and lawsuits in the coming days, perhaps weeks, and then, you know, and what are some of the possibilities that we could see in front of us in the coming days and weeks, and try to set the stage a little bit for my fellow panelists who might speak a little bit more about what we'll see in terms of civil society and protests and possibly violence and those sort of things as well, things that we would like not to see, but are possibilities, definitely. So as Christine kind of laid out the picture, right now things are looking good for Joe Biden in Pennsylvania specifically, right? And if the votes keep trending in that particular way, he's going to win Pennsylvania, which will hand him the presidency right there. And it will no longer matter what's going on in Georgia, Arizona, or Nevada, or poor North Carolina, which nobody talks about anymore because it's just assumed that it's going to go to Trump. So, so assuming that happens, as Christine said, it looks likely that Biden will become the next president. And what happens after that, right? I mean, the counting will continue in the states where it needs to continue, in Nevada and Arizona, but that will continue even if a winner has been declared. And so we'll see how those states finish, because it's necessary for when the formal transition from the Electoral College occurs. Because Biden's victory in Wisconsin was less than 1%, there will be a recount there, right? The opponent, the losing candidate, has a right to request a recount when that happens, and of course Trump has requested one. Georgia, I think they've already announced that they're going to do a recount. They're not quite done there yet, but at this point Biden leads by something like 1,200 votes, right? It's razor thin there as well. So there'll be recounts in Georgia and Wisconsin. Pennsylvania, there can be a recount if somebody requests it, if the margin of victory is within 0.5%. right? So it's a little bit more narrow, the threshold there. But as you may have noticed, if you've been paying close attention to this, and all of you have, election officials have really been trying more than usual, probably, to be super transparent about what they're doing, right? And they're giving news conferences and they're explaining when maybe things are going wrong, as the Clark County registrar did earlier this evening in Nevada. So they're trying to do that, and along those lines, it may be that Pennsylvania decides to do a recount, even if they're not legally required to do it, and try to preempt President Trump. So we might see, we're already seeing recounts in 2 states, and we may see them in 3. Okay, so that's going to happen. Each state has its own laws about when those recounts need to happen. They need to happen fairly soon. I can't remember the specifics on each one, but they can't drag them out too long, obviously. In terms of lawsuits, right? We've heard a lot about lawsuits over the past few days, and I think on Tuesday night, several of us were worried that maybe there was the potential for protracted litigation, right? That things were really going to go wrong. And I would say between Tuesday and today, I think it's become more and more apparent that basically what there is behind Trump's claims is a lot of bluster, right? There's a lot of claims that there's fraud, and there's really no specific evidence that there is any fraud. Where his team has brought lawsuits so far, they've been turned down. They've been for legitimate things, but they've been for fairly small things, right? Like the claim that in Pennsylvania and in Michigan that his campaign his people in the campaign did not have adequate access to see what was going on as election monitors, right? And once it was established in at least one of those states that they did have access, then they tried to bring a follow-up suit saying, well, we weren't close enough to the votes that were being tallied. And a similar lawsuit came in Michigan where they said, we want you to stop counting the ballots. And the judge said, well, that's fine, except we've already declared the state a winner for Joe Biden and we're not counting anymore. So your point is moot, right? So there have been these sort of lawsuits put forward. The only lawsuit that looks like it might have any influence over the process, but even that is a bit of a stretch, I'd say, is the issue of the 3-day extension in Pennsylvania, which the U.S. Supreme Court heard prior to the election, where because that was done by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court granted a request of the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania to allow postmarked ballots, that is ballots that are postmarked by Election Day, to arrive 3 days after the election. Some of the conservative judges on the Supreme Court took issue with this, and they indicated that they might want to revisit this after the election. Now, does that mean that votes that are being counted now would be thrown out? I don't believe it would, but I'm not absolutely positive. But we'll have to see what comes of that. All of the other lawsuits that have been filed have not really gone anywhere. But Trump's campaign has indicated that he'll pretty much follow these lawsuits. He'll just keep filing them until he finds something that sticks, assuming that he does. But I don't think from all the other legal analysts and from everything I've read, it doesn't appear that the result in Pennsylvania is under any real danger. So that's it's not going to be changed, I should say. So that's something to consider with the lawsuit. So I think there's not very much strong evidence that there's fraud. There's very little evidence at all, or of any irregularities. And so it's not clear that Trump really has a path there as well. So here's where you start to get now into the more informal area, right? Where the things that I know Christine is afraid of, and that Consuelo and Gina are going to discuss as well. Like, can Trump find informal ways to generate unrest in the streets and bring about violence and threaten the results in other ways like that? And that seems to be honestly what he's trying to do. He's trying to claim widespread fraud, but his lawyers are really going after more itty-bitty kind of cases for the most part, right? Trying to claim that there's issues of fraud here and there, but it's not really fraud. It's more just minor irregularities that can't be generalized much further. So with Trump, the question then becomes, I suppose, are his inflammatory tweets, and I think we can all agree that that's what they are, coming not just from him, but as what Christine mentioned, from Newt Gingrich, Donald Trump Jr. on Twitter last night talking about going to total war. very inflammatory language being used by Trump and a lot of his allies, right? And to what extent is this being echoed or shared by other Republican colleagues? Lindsey Graham, obviously feeling pretty chuffed after his reelection, said that he stood with the president, but I don't think he elaborated much more on that. Other senators, congressmen, many of them have remained silent. But the ones who are seeking a middle ground, who want to seem supportive of the president while also being supportive of the democratic process, seem to be saying the president is right to demand that the process be fair, and if there is any evidence of fraud, people should present that, right? So where that language becomes concerning is that in some cases, sitting congressmen and women are suggesting that people need to go out and look for the fraud, right? And you could see that that might result in a situation where you have protesters, banging on the door in Nevada and in Michigan and trying to get into places where hardworking civil servants are just trying to count the votes. It doesn't seem very fair to them. So the question really will become: what is the rest of the Republican Party going to do if Trump escalates his language, his inflammatory language, which it's reasonable to think he's going to do, especially in an inverse relationship to how well his legal challenges are going, right? The less fruit that his legal challenges bear, the more we can suspect that he and his allies are going to ratchet up the legal claims, and he may expect Bill Barr to do something on his behalf. I'm not sure what that could be. The only other thing I'll finish up with, right, is where for people who aren't as familiar with the Electoral College, right, and you wonder like, oh, can anything happen there? With the Electoral College, the idea is that for those of us who did vote in the U.S. just now, and I guess that's just me, I'm not voting for a president in New York, which is where I voted, but I'm voting for the electors, right? And each state has a set of electors who will then go to Congress on December 14th and issue their vote to the House of Representatives to indicate who's going to be president. Now, there's been this concern that there's this thing called faithless electors. In other words, somebody in this spectacular principal agent problem, somebody who masquerades as an elector for, say, Joe Biden and then goes and secretly casts his ballot for Donald Trump, right? Apparently, this virtually has never happened until 2016, when there were about 10 instances of it, right? And since then, you've seen a flurry of litigation of states that have enacted laws barring the existence of faithless electors, right? So making it a crime to go and cast your vote for somebody else when you're an elector, when you've been designated by the party to vote for, in this case, Joe Biden or Donald Trump, right? So 32 states have these laws. Funny story, neither Georgia or Pennsylvania have these laws. They're among the 18 that don't have them, right? So I'd have to look a little bit further to see what exactly is holding them. But most of the legal experts who have spoken to this said that this received so much attention after 2016, and that the parties have spent so much time vetting the loyalty of their electors that we really don't need to worry about the faithless elector problem, right? It doesn't mean that you could, given Donald Trump's history, given his lack of respect for norms, maybe he would try to do something with electors against all advice coming to him, but that would be an absolute last resort. Anyway, that's how the Electoral College process works. There doesn't seem to be a lot of tampering ability there. I wouldn't expect any change there. I think the action, right, is probably going to come somewhere in between the realization for Trump that his lawsuits are not really going anywhere, and what he does there. And I think that's probably where I ought to hand it over to my fellow panelists at this point.
But before you do that, I want you to answer one more question, and that is, what happened to the polls, right? So what happened to that landslide? And I know, Tereza, I know actually, several of us can speak to this, but I suspect you're the person that has paid the most attention to those numbers. So can you say something about what happened to that landslide? Where did the numbers go wrong? Polling methodology.
I'm flattered that you're designating me the polling expert. I don't feel like a polling expert. I'm not one, but I'll riff anyway on that. So I said in an event yesterday that I didn't think it was. There's a couple things there. I didn't think it was so wrong, right? Florida, okay, Florida doesn't look very good, right? 538 was giving Biden a 65% chance up until election day of winning Florida. Most of the polls showed him ahead, but within the margin of error, right? The other states that went heavily for Trump, Ohio, Iowa, those did break in the polls for Trump late. So I think Florida is kind of the outstanding case where things seem to go really wrong. You can point to some of the Senate seats, right, where it seems that there should have been much more, according to the polls, there should have been much more Democratic support for Sarah Gideon in Maine over Susan Collins, for Tereza Greenfield in Iowa over Joni Ernst, for Tom Tillis, or sorry, for Cal Cunningham in North Carolina over Tom Tillis, although that race is still not decided. And what I suggested maybe is that what you see going on in some of these places is that there is a desire for divided government, right? So it's possible that in some places people cast their ballot for Biden and then cast their ballot for a Republican senator, or vice versa, right? Which is something you used to see more often. But nowadays, with polarization the way it is, we usually think of people voting a straight ticket across the board. And the other thing is, and because I'm not a polling expert, I don't want to go too far into this, but you do have to think that there's been a lot of talk about how everything's improved. Some of the people who did say that Trump was going to win this time, some of the polling experts, and there weren't that many of them, did say that, well, how much can you really trust, if you're calling people on landlines, right, is that really reliable, right? If you're calling people on mobile phones, you say, of course, that's the next thing, but how many of us, actually answer our mobile phones, right? If it's not a number we know. And if you're a good survey researcher, you're supposed to keep calling, but it's very easy to block numbers that you don't know, right? So this is a question I honestly don't know the answer to, but it seems like a reasonable question about, are we reaching the random sample we intend, or is the sample becoming different because we can't reach people? And does that then have an impact, right? I'm not going to say anything about the shy Trump voter because I've read things on both sides, and I'm not sure what the evidence really is on that front. So those are a few thoughts on polling. I'm not, Tereza might have some things to say on that as well, because she's done way more survey research than I ever have, which is not much. So I'll let her take over when the time comes there.
I'm counting on Tereza to talk about this because she already told me she wanted to speak about it. So, but let me go next to Consuelo, who I think is going to tell us a little bit more about the social movements and mobilization side and what might happen in response to some of the things that Colin has just described. Consuelo.
Right. Thank you so much, Christine, and to everyone. So I first wanted to give my general impressions about how I've observed the election so far, especially having to do with the prospects for democracy in the country. So one thing is to note that, I was very kind of shocked by the fact that Trump won more than 6 million votes than last time. So that's something very significant. Trump does have a lot of support in the United States, and that's something that regardless of who wins, it needs to be understood and dealt with in a very profound way if we want democracy to remain strong and institutions to remain strong. The second thing to note is that Biden did win more votes than any other president in history. And the vote hasn't been, the count hasn't been ended yet. So it is pretty remarkable. So my assessment there is that voter turnout is really at an all-time high. In decades, I think it was a century that they were saying, and that's pretty good for democracy. That's, participation, political participation is really important. I would say that also the fact that there was really just no electoral violence, so violence on the day of, is actually something that seems, was really good. It's kind of a low bar for democracy for a developed country, but we were expecting maybe in some areas to see some violence, and fortunately that did not happen. And it seems like election day went pretty smoothly. I've actually been very impressed by the elections officials that I've observed on TV and the way that they've answered questions. I think two things have probably been responsible for the lack of electoral violence and even violence during the counting. I would say number one is the elections officials just have legitimacy in the eyes of the population in general for a few reasons. One is, up to now, there's been many times where I've seen Trump make statements that are extremely outrageous, and then those statements have actual consequences. I've seen, the Muslim ban, and then actually goes into effect. things like this. But in this case, Trump has done really made some scary comments and very aggressive comments about the fraud and et cetera on Twitter and in press conferences, even in the White House. But then you turn to the TV and you see the count is progressing, and you see the transparency of these elections happening. You see the little camera with the people counting the votes. So you see a really big disparity between the words of the president and the actual reality of the institutions at work. And I think that just brought so much more kind of a legitimacy to the process in the eyes of the population. We were kind of all on edge, and I think that that has reduced the level of the possibility of mobilization around possible fraud or something like that. The other factor I would say is what Christine mentioned, the media, how it's responded. I think, even Fox News, which I would have expected to not be as good and to actually run on these fraud and these things. In general, what I've observed is that actually they have probably made a mistake on the other end of the spectrum, which is calling Arizona too early, because it seems like it might not go for Biden. But in general, they've been, all the networks have been really good about reporting and staying, on message that the count is still going, and even, filming Trump on his statements about fraud and actually cutting some of the networks, cutting him out, explaining that those are lies, and then going back to him. So I think that was pretty powerful and important. On the other hand, what's bad for democracy that I've observed is that the recent polling that we've observed about people's sentiments around democracy. So I think we mentioned some of this in the last event, but basically the fact that Americans, a lot of Americans, a really high percentage of Americans, if you put them the choice of an election, democratic institutions versus their preference for policies, they would choose less democracy to obtain the policies that they would like. And I think just the value of democracy in itself is something that is suffering in this country. And I think that's something that we need to really address in the next 4 years, regardless of who's president. The second thing I would say is that fake news showed its power in actual electoral votes, I think. Especially, and this gets into some of the second commentary I wanted to give, which is about Latino voters. And I was born and raised in Venezuela, so I was particularly interested in seeing how Florida played out, given Cubans, but also the new immigrant population from Venezuela in Florida. And I mean, this is both anecdotally and just looking at the statistics, but I think that the messaging around Biden being a communist, which is actually laughable, if you even just have minimal level of understanding of who Biden is for decades, plus the criticism from the left within the Democratic Party towards Biden, the fact that there were so many candidates and clearly he was in the center. But it was extremely effective, this rhetoric that Biden at least was going to be influenced by communists, socialists like AOC. And it brought such fear to a population that has a history of basically PTSD around anyone who approaches anything related to socialism. Around, obviously, the Cubans have a history of that and have for decades been a Republican bloc. But the new immigrant population from Venezuela, I would say, paradoxically, in my eyes, voting for someone who is authoritarian in many tendencies, but on the same time, but then again, they see him as more on their side because of capitalism and big business and things like this. So it was extreme. For me, it was very disappointing to see. But what I get away from that is that the power of fake news. And I think we need to address some of that as well. On the other hand, Latinos are, and we've heard this a million times, they're not a homogenous group. So you have Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Central Americans and a different type of immigrant population in other states like Arizona and Nevada voting very differently and actually allowing Biden to come ahead. So I would say that on the mobilization, for the run-up of the election. I think that's also something actually positive around democracy. We saw a lot of ground game that the Democrats did. I mean, the type of turnout is amazing, and it's not explained fully by passion as it is in the Trump camp, because people in the Democratic Party were not as passionate for Biden as pro-Trump people are for Trump. And so you needed that ground game. And I think one really interesting case will be looking at Arizona and grassroots organizations like La Lucha in those places. It's just really important to study those cases of grassroots organizing and how voter turnout is just, really amazing due to that. On mobilization post-election, so what do I expect now, especially if Trump doesn't concede? This question of whether he concedes or not. So I would say I agree with Gina's tweet earlier. I don't know if I saw, but I agree that basically we don't need Trump to concede officially. That it's not something that is required by law, as I understand it. And the second thing is that I found really funny or interesting the answer that the Biden campaign had to that. He said they said that the American government has the capacity to remove trespassers from the White House if that is that needs to be done. So I'm not concerned about that specific aspect of him just saying, I'm not going to concede, I'm going to stay in the White House, and him staying. I just don't think that's possible for many reasons. But I do think that it's what I'm going to be looking at basically is these 2 months of a lame duck president that's erratic, and who is particularly, I think, important is the fact that his fate post-presidency is actually very much at risk compared to other presidents in US history, where there's so many lawsuits against him, so many prosecutions and possibilities for him ending up in jail, that I think he really had a huge personal interest in remaining in power. And so I think that that's going to make him very erratic and possibly do some crazy things during the 2 months that he has in power. So I would say that I'm going to be looking at what his actions are. I think we should be following that very closely. I think mobilization is very likely to happen from the Democrats and leftists and progressives if something happens around the Justice Department. He has a really important ally in William Barr, and we've seen William Barr willing to go very far in supporting Trump. And I don't know, my imagination is not big enough to know exactly what could happen, and I don't want to make predictions, but I will be extremely cautious and kind of looking at what those actions are. And I think mobilization potentially can happen around those things, around steps to undermine the election results, or through these lawsuits and things like that, or just undermining the possibility that the transition will not be as smoothly, or that he just reduces the chance that maybe prosecutions and things like that can happen in the future. So those are my comments, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Consuelo, for all of those slightly alarming comments, but also very encouraging ones. I wanted to just back up what Consuelo was saying a moment ago with just a couple of data slides that I showed last week that I think not everybody saw last week, but I think might be just helpful for a little bit of context. So I'm going to share my screen just for a minute or two, because there are two things I want to show you. So one is this slide from Pippa Norris, who's a researcher, runs a World Values Survey out of Harvard, and does a lot of work on illiberalism and also on democracy. And this is her slide. So rising support for authoritarianism in America. And you can see the question here is, I'm going to describe various types of political systems and ask what you think about each as a way of governing this country. So for each one, would you say it's very good, fairly bad, or a very bad way of governing this country? So having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. And this is about the percentage of Americans who would say that this is very or fairly good, right? And you can see that the change over time has gone up, right? So that's alarming slide number one. Here's alarming slide number two, which will, I think, partly lead into what Gina's going to talk about. So this is about commitment to nonviolence by party. And you can see the blue line is the Democrats and the red line is the Republicans. And you can see that split between the two being rather alarming. So I just wanted to share that with you before Gina goes into her remarks. So Gina, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Christine. And it's really good to see everyone again. Hello to any newcomers that we have also this week. So today in our post-election wrap-up, or perhaps the first of several installments, if we do this again in a few weeks or in a month, I wanted to talk about three things. So first, to put the election results, insofar as they're known, in some context, and sort of think about the broader interpretation of what's happened. Second, to talk about the prospects for violence going forward. And then third, to talk about the future of politics and democracy in the US a bit, in the kind of 1 to 4 years into the future timeframe. So first, a bit of context. Last week when we were together, we were talking about really three possibilities, I think, which were a narrow Trump win, a narrow Biden win, or a Biden landslide. I think it's fairly clear that we're unlikely to see either a Trump win or the Biden landslide at this point. And we're in the realm of a fairly narrow Biden win. But, I think that a lot of us, because of the experiences of the last few days, are seeing the election as very close. That this is a very close election that's going to come in history as a nail biter. And it's interesting to ask ourselves what would have happened if all these votes were counted very, very, very quickly on election night. Because in the end, now we don't know what the final counts will be, of course, but it seems possible that in the end, Biden might actually win most of the states that are up for grabs at this point. He could end up winning Arizona. He could end up winning Nevada. He could end up winning Georgia, possible, and he could end up winning Pennsylvania. So if that happened, and if the other results stayed as they currently are, he would end up with 306 electoral votes. And that's a pretty solid win. Ironically, it's the number of electoral votes that Trump won based on the election map back in 2016. He actually ended up getting 2 fewer electoral votes because, as Colin was mentioning, there were some faithless electors. But based on the election results, Trump was supposed to have had 306 votes back in 2016. And then on top of that, this year for Biden, there would also be a decisive win in the popular vote. So it depends, of course, how we think about what is a close election. I think we're unfortunately perhaps conflating close and stressful. This has been plenty stressful, even if maybe it ends up not really being sort of particularly close by most metrics in the end. And again, to put this in context, Obama did have larger electoral college victories, but both of George W. Bush's wins were with fewer electoral votes than what Biden might end up with in this case. So, of course, George W. Bush had 271 electoral votes in 2000. That really was a very close election. And then in 2004, even again, running as an incumbent, seeking re-election, he got 286 electoral votes. So, there are different interpretations of what's happening right now. And there's a lot of hand-wringing on the Democratic side, perhaps because expectations were very high due to the polling. But if we take a step back and if we started with the assumption that, the United States is fairly evenly divided, and that particularly in key states, it was always known that it was going to be very close. And in fact, it was. But the outcome, in a lot of those key battleground states does seem to be favoring the Democrats and Biden going forward. Then, perhaps we shouldn't really be that surprised by where this shakes out in the end. All right, so on to the question of violence, though. And I think that there are a number of really extraordinary things happening around this election. And it's not so much the results that matter, but it's the context. And as Christine has already signaled, it's the type of language being used, and the fact that there's really a lot of fear in the country. It's a concerning situation. And for my part, the time frame that I'm really concerned about is this weekend. So I feel like the talk and the kind of social media messaging and things in the last few days has been groundwork. It's communication to supporters. from Trump and allies to the supporters. It's setting a tone. But the key decisive thing hasn't happened yet, which is Biden declaring victory. I think that at the point that if Biden comes out and says, enough of the vote is counted, it is certain that I'm going to win, we're declaring victory. If networks actually started calling the race for Biden, Biden supporters go out and celebrate. I worry that that's when you would see a big reaction from right-wing and potentially armed groups. And I worry about the context. I worry that Biden is giving a statement, it sounds like at night tonight, and we're going into a weekend. The weather is fairly warm in a number of these key locations, which, honestly, we could use a little freezing rain and some sleet right about now to keep people inside, because we know that more bad things happen with groups of agitated people when there is warm weather and when it's a Friday night and a Saturday night. So I worry, and I think that it is not unreasonable to think that there could be sort of significant clashes, disturbances, arrests, and things like that throughout the weekend. But I feel like a lot of the die is cast there, and it's just a matter of waiting, hoping things remain calm, and hoping that law enforcement is able to disrupt any organized violence that's attempted. In terms of the future, that might be even bleaker than what I just said. So I think, there has been some debate about, especially with Trump's statements about not conceding, what if he doesn't leave the White House? Like, how does this really play out? What I think that we've seen from Trump over time, and even in the last few days, is that when there are formal rules in place, hard, fast, formal rules that are concretely codified, he does usually comply at the end of the day. And so I agree with Consuelo that the idea that he ends up in the White House just literally not leaving is just extremely unlikely. Something that concerns me, though, is that the area where Trump really pushes the envelope is in the realm of informal norms, which clearly have no meaning. There is no such thing as a norm for the man. And so I think we are going to continue to see a lot of norm-breaking behavior in the next 2 months, and I think beyond. So, one outcome I did not necessarily anticipate from the election, but I think is developing, is that Trump is actually emerging from this with a lot of political power and a lot of political clout. And, I personally had thought that if he lost, he would lose more significantly, and that would drive Republican Party leaders and other key leaders to say, oh, if we want to survive politically, if we want our party to survive, we have to distance ourselves, we have to denounce him, and that he would really start losing institutional support and elite support sort of from his own side. And in fact, I don't think that's happening. I think that there's a message out there, which is, wow, he did remarkably well. Wow, he won all these new votes. And you see, again, some of the allies like circling the wagons back. I mean, just a few weeks ago, all these Senate candidates and others were distancing themselves and saying, oh, you need to have, we don't think Trump's going to win re-election, but you need to have a Senate to check a Biden presidency, a Republican Senate to check a Biden presidency, and things like that. And now they're back, right? And so I think that Trump actually emerges from this situation with quite a lot of assets. He has a massive direct communications system at his disposal. He can communicate directly with, let's say 80 to 100 million Americans at almost no cost to him. He has access to funds, even without throwing his own money into future endeavors. He has this massive base of small dollar donors that I think will remain quite loyal to him. And, and as I was saying, he also, I think, is going to emerge from this with a fair amount of sort of political infrastructure at his fingertips, both in the sense of data, but also in the sense of key political relationships being intact and maybe even strengthened. And so I don't think, I see Consuelo, someone saying in the chat, unless he goes to jail. I actually am going to talk about that in a second. So I actually don't think that this is a total loss for Trump. And if we think of Trump as a populist, which I think is really the key way of understanding him, I think of him more as a populist than as a violent actor. Every loss in like a formal legal battle or in a lawsuit is actually a political win for him. And every time that rules sort of crack down on him in some way or constrain his behavior, he can spin that as a political, to his political advantage. And, so what I mean is that for a populist, the fact that courts are ruling against you, that courts are throwing out your frivolous lawsuits, that is just more evidence that he can grab onto and say, oh, look, the elites and the system and the deep state are oppressing me and they're keeping our movement down, even though I speak for the people. And same for, unfortunately, criminal charges. So even if he ended up facing some sort of tax fraud charges, or he ended up facing, other legal problems in the future, so perversely, when populists get prosecuted, they often get more popular. And it can be taken as, again, evidence, or spun as evidence that there's a conspiracy against him, that he's the victim, that these powerful, corrupt elites are doing this to him, and that, he's the defender of good, and people need to stand with him to fight off these sort of unfounded accusations. And so I see a lot of groundwork being laid now for the potential continuation of that kind of messaging indefinitely into the future. And there are a number of different things that Trump's political future could hold. I think it's not inconceivable that he could simply start running for 2024 almost immediately, just continue the MAGA rallies. He has all the infrastructure that you would need to run a campaign. It wouldn't be particularly expensive. It would give him power. It would keep him relevant. It would keep him in the spotlight. There are other kind of similar political roles he could play, either as a party kingmaker. He could try to anoint a successor. That's something that we see populists do sometimes also, is start sending out one of their adult children instead in their place. So basically, there's been some hand wringing about how well the election happened, but it's not over. Is it really even going to end on January 20th? Is there going to be continued conflict up until January 20th? I actually think there's going to be continued significant political conflict well beyond January 20th. And I don't see Trump as someone who relinquishes the spotlight voluntarily and sort of goes quietly into the sunset. And unfortunately, I think he's emerged from this situation with enough political support and enough of a political argument that he can make to key gatekeepers within the Republican Party that he remains very, very relevant in Republican politics for a long time to come. So I think that's what the future holds. And I do see it as not a slide into authoritarianism, but a slide into sort of a democracy that's increasingly high conflict, where populism is an increasingly strong factor around organizing participation. And that's not inconsistent with high levels of formal participation though. So like Consuelo was saying, I do think that we're likely to see high levels of engagement in the future, but there may be a lot of conflict that goes along with that.
High levels of engagement, potentially higher levels of violence as well, sadly. Who knows, right? This is, we're moving into uncertain times here. Does Trumpism survive? And what does this say about, where does this go as a movement? He's called it himself a movement, right? So for those of us in the UK thinking about Corbyn and that kind of social movement, or Bernie Sanders and that social movement, I think Trump is labeling his followers as a movement now, which is a really interesting terminology to be using here. I think this sets up perfectly for Tereza and the comments that she's going to make. So I'm looking forward to having this deconstructed for us psychologically. Tereza.
So I just realized I was muted, and now I am unmuted. So thank you, Christine, for the invitation, and I'm glad to be on this side of the table this week. It's exciting to be among very wise colleagues and friends. I don't know to what extent I can add a lot to what already has been said very wisely, but what I'm going to try to do is flip it around and make us feel a little bit good, because we are sliding down a very negative emotional path, and I think we need to be aware of holding ourselves back a little bit, bringing ourselves back to the present, to the now, right? Okay, so there are so many things to talk about. One of the things that you've asked me to talk about is a little bit the emotional climate, and all in terms of now and where it's going. So, and I realized, look at my notes, I like to put things in threes for some reason, so I'll take it like that. So thinking about let's say the road ahead. We are starting at the present. We are starting at the now, and the now is a very anxious moment, and it's a moment where people are anticipating things to happen. Lots of people are feeling what we call anticipatory anxiety, and I wrote an article in The Conversation yesterday exactly on that, on the anxieties that you experience at the time where you don't know what's coming. And for many of us, when the results in different states have not been called yet, the general election has not been called yet, definitely what you feel is this anticipatory anxiety. And usually that mobilizes people, that gets them to go out and do things. And the high turnout we have been looking at might not be because of high engagement with democracy or support for democratic values. It might be just a response to anticipatory anxiety because people just have the tendency to go out and do things when they're anxious, to avoid what we call traumatic anxiety, the bad anxiety that's coming as your worst fear, when either you're afraid that you're going to lose something you really like, or you're afraid that you're going to gain something that you don't want to have. And that can work both ways. So this is the short term, and how people deal with this anxiety is very important because it has negative implications for their mental health. It can have negative implications for their physical health. And the longer it goes on, the more intense these results or these effects are going to be. The second thing we need to be thinking about is the close to now, so within a week, so the very close immediate future. It's shorter than short term, it's the shorter term. And that is what happens when the results are announced. So again, I'm not going to talk very much about Trump. You know, when we think about democracy, we have the demos, which are the people, and we have the state, the kratos. And when we talk about leaders, we focus on the kratos side, but it's important. Well, I'm a political psychologist. I study the demos. I study the people that constitute this space. So I'll talk a little bit about that. What happens when the results are announced? Because 50% of the population in the United States, or the voting population that has some engagement with politics, will feel that they are in the side of a loser. And nobody likes to be in the side of a loser. It comes with really negative emotional reactions. Some people might experience it as, again, anxiety about what's going to happen ahead. How are they going to manage particular policies, their finances, the security of the country, you name it. But what might be hiding underneath that anxiety, masking it really well, is anger and frustration that sometimes does not find ways to express itself. And sometimes we think, okay, people should be calm and quiet and not really go out and demonstrate, but expressing your anger and your frustration can be a very healthy thing in democracy. You need to vent it out. If you don't vent it out, really bad things happen. And some of the bad things that can happen is repressing it. When you're repressing your anger, again, you can have psychosomatic implications. You can get sick. Democracies, people do get sick in collectives as well. But then other things that can happen as part of that containing the let's say very forced containment of anger is what we call splitting. And I'll explain that a little bit. Is when you see the word as only bad or only good, the people you love versus the people you hate. In most of us, that makes sense, translates to polarization, right? The big divide that we see between the two dominant parties, different groups in society where people think, I am good and you are evil, right? Projecting all your negative stuff on the other, keeping the best for yourself. Other things that can happen there when, again, you're very anxious, traumatized, but you don't know how to deal with it, is reality checking is compromised. So people do not have the capacity, they don't have the strength, the emotional strength to engage with information in a critical way. They tend to push away from information that is not convenient, that is not comfortable, that doesn't fit what they already know, or it doesn't go along with what they already want. So a lot of motivational resistance there. And that can lead to phenomena like the ones we have seen, the preference for fake news, easy manipulation, propaganda being successful. Now, these things are not just successful because the politicians are evil or the media are evil. It's because there is an undercurrent, there is a platform there that is receptive to these processes. So if we think of the psychological mechanisms that help us understand why there is traction for these kind of procedures, this kind of phenomena happening, I think we can think constructively ahead on how to fix it. Oh, I get my pinky note. Okay. So middle term then, as if these angers or these resentments, these frustrations are not expressed constructively, they don't have a way to vent themselves in a way that wouldn't hurt others, right? That is acknowledged, that is discussed, that is, how can we do this in a way that we understand the frustrations, accept them, and then turn them into what they constructively be handled as? That is sadness, the acceptance of loss, the acceptance of defeat, and then constructive mobilization, constructive engagement within democracy. So my answer for this short term would not be to mute people, to not let people get out on the streets and demonstrate, but to allow them to demonstrate in a way that we are accustomed to, based on democratic principles, but respecting the other, expressing your frustration, but not with violence. Right? Repressing it is not going to be good for anybody. And then the third term, the third stage, the third level is, how do we deal with negative effects in the long term? What are the things that are at stake? We talked about authoritarianism. We talked about compromise of civil liberties. We know that when people feel threatened, when people feel ignored, when they're frustrated, they compromise their civil liberties and they become more authoritarian, more in support. They give more support to authority. This is something that we know. We've been studying it for decades now. And we also know that their hope goes down. One of the problems that I see coming up that we need to be really sensitive towards is the fact that as we are having these debates about corruption, electoral corruption, the lack of trust in the democratic process and democracy these days, that can really compromise the hope of Americans for government. And we've had a problem for a long time, allowing people, giving people resources and information in order for them to feel that their government cares for them and they have some kind of efficacy to participate in government. If you take that away, you end up with cynical citizens. You end up with citizens that do not engage following democratic principles. So again, that opens up a big issue. And all of that, leaving Trump aside, just very quickly as I close, because I think my pinky note was for me to wrap it up, Christine, right? I can't see it because your screen is shining. 2 minutes, right? So as I'm wrapping it up there, thinking about America divided, I think the key is for us to think, and I think all of us have a responsibility to educate, to inform, to allow people to find avenues to express themselves constructively, to learn to see the other, to learn to be a little bit more comfortable with each other and go beyond this big division that creates barriers, walls between people and how they can communicate. And then the other thing is, just quickly jumping in, Regina, it makes sense, right? Political scientists see Trump as a populist. Political psychologists see them as a narcissist. So what do you do with that? What you do with that is you engage, you follow a little bit all the knowledge that we have in psychology about how you deal with narcissists. And one of the things you don't do is hurt them directly, because they fight back, and they fight back nasty because they have no empathy. They don't have any consideration for the well-being of the other. They don't have what we identify as guilt or reparative guilt, like this sense that you've done something bad and you want to go back and repair it. You want to help the other person that you hurt recover. There is no such thing there. And there's usually a lot of shame, but you can work with that. You can work with that shame. You can turn it around by turning it into praise. So there are mechanisms. People in the Republican Party are probably aware of those and hopefully have some knowledge on how to handle this. But the other thing that you do if you want to be free of a narcissist is not give them space, not just not give him space to talk, because you cannot take anybody's freedom of expression away from them, but you can take your ears away, you can take your eyes away from them. Narcissists don't have a sense of self. They only see themselves through the eyes of somebody else. If the eyes turn around, narcissists lose their own image. You starve their image by taking your eyes away, turning your ears away. If we can do that, then we can stop this from happening without taking away anybody's liberties, restraining them, constraining them, taking down their Twitter accounts or anything like this. Narcissists live through the eyes and the ears of the others. And we have responsibility on that, all of us, in terms of how we say things, what we say, and what we decide and choose to keep quiet.
Thanks, Tereza. It's funny that you would say that. Right before I got on to the seminar, I was listening to Maggie Haberman on the Daily talking about what fuels this, and she was saying that a key player in what happens next will be the conservative media, because it's the conservative media that has made Trump who he is and that has direct reach into his supporters. And it is that turning of attention, right, that fuels him and drives him and feeds his ego. And to the extent that wind is taken out of his sails, then, this changes the discourse and it changes the whole trajectory of what comes next, potentially. So I think, there are the Republican leaders that legitimize him. There is the conservative media that will enable him and allow him to make his message more widespread and to make it go viral in a lot of cases. And then there's us, right, on the other end of this, right, how we respond as the public. So thank you for all of that. I think we've got a bunch of questions that we could probably go straight to now. I think I'm going to try. I think I might even have privileges to try and unmute people. So we'll see if we can do that. I think everybody can do that. I'm hoping everybody can do that.
Sarah, shall I remove me from the spotlight, because I think I am the only one that people can see?
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out how to remove you from the spotlight.
I think I have.
Oh, have you? Do you know how to do it?
No, I had a little button that says remove from spotlight, and I think I did, but I don't know how that brings us all back together. I don't know that.
So I can see in my own view, I think in the upper right-hand corner for everybody else, I think you can choose gallery view or you can choose spotlight view perhaps, or speaker view. And hopefully if you choose speaker view, then you can see all of that. I think I can, what I will do, is everybody able to do that? So then hopefully you can all see. I'm going to take questions from the floor, and I'll start with the ones in the Q&A. So we've got Carl, and I'm just going to allow you to talk, and then you can ask your own questions. So let me find Carl and unmute him and allow him to ask his question. So Carl is an MA student of mine, so from King. So Carl, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, hello. I hope everyone can hear me, right?
Yeah, perfectly.
Hi. So I just had a question on some of the actual legal safeguards that keep someone like Trump from, if he did decide not to drag it out as far as humanly possible and refuse to leave. I mean, people say talk a lot about kind of like how Biden said about, well, the government has the power to take a trespasser out and these things, but I think it's hard to visualize exactly what that would look like and some of the processes that would go into all of that, because obviously sometimes it's more difficult than just sticking to police or military on him, especially when he has such a broad support among things like the police. So I think it's kind of a dark idea, but something that looms in the mind of a lot of people is, what happens if it comes down to that, and what are some of the legal repercussions of it, I guess.
So I'll leave that. Did you want to direct that at someone?
No, just the panel as a whole, I suppose.
Okay. And then I've got, let's see, who did I? Oh, I've got Christopher.
Hello. I used to be a student of Colin's, but I was just wondering if you were advising Trump and you only really cared about winning, you didn't care about anything else, what would your next step be? Would you be looking to have the Pennsylvania legislature try and override the votes? Would you just claim victory? What's the kind of nuclear option if you were just 100% Machiavellian?
I think Colin, being as Machiavellian as he is, will be able to answer that perfectly. So I've got Emily.
Yeah, my question, it was pretty much to do with what Regina was talking about. There was mention of the Republican institutions and how if they kind of stop supporting him, then he'll essentially that he needs that support. But our question was, with his like really strong Twitter presence and how many people in the sort of American electorate that reaches, does he really need the support of the like Republican institutions and the support of senators and things like that to remain relevant?
Yeah. I'm moving into the chat questions now, and there's actually one from YouTube that comes from Archit Sharma, and the question is, does the American Constitution have provisions to set up an election commission which can standardize the process and overlook the proceedings? So I suspect that one would probably go to Colin unless others might know more about this. So I'll leave that there on the table for anyone who wants to answer it. And then I've got, let's see. Oh, and I've got one from Gina, if Gina wants to ask Tereza the question. Yeah?
Sure. I mean, I feel like the actual audience members should get their questions addressed first.
Yeah, but yours is a great question, because I was thinking the same thing. I mean, I say this to Tereza all the time, right? Like, what do we do about this? So why don't you ask it? Because I think it's great.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say quickly that I loved your comments and I thought they were very perceptive. And I think that sort of, seeing Trump as a narcissist, maybe it provides more of a pathway forward than just seeing him as a populist where we're kind of stuck with him in this bad dynamic. But I wondered why, if people, when we bring the populism back in, and if some of his supporters actually think that he's speaking for them, he's the one who's out there fighting for them, he's representing their interests, why would they turn away? How could they be incentivized to turn away? How could they be convinced to turn away? And also he has this proactive, pre-established media infrastructure through social media where he can, proactively reach out to people and grab their attention back, and to do that in a mass way and a pretty low cost way. And so I guess I wonder, why would his supporters turn their attention away from him? And also, how does kind of like the social media platform and his ability to proactively go do communications and try to stay relevant, sort of how does that play out? And how would that affect people's ability to turn away or not when he just, keeps creating drama after drama and car crash after car crash, essentially to stay present in people's minds?
I've got another one here from an anonymous attendee. It says, despite Biden's win, this election was a disaster for the Democratic Party, who barely eked out a victory despite the massive failures of the Trump presidency. Meanwhile, DSA supported candidates were resoundingly successful. Now that Biden has won the presidency, how might a battle for ideological supremacy within the Democratic Party play out? So I think that could be Consuelo, it could be Regina. I suspect both of you would have very interesting answers to that one. And then I've got
Christine,
yep.
That's 6 questions and I've already forgotten what the first 3 are. So can we take these?
All of them. You're supposed to write them down. Okay, fine. I'll go back to you guys first. I'm most worried about losing some of you because I know we've got children about to melt down and so forth. So let me turn it back to you guys. So Colin, why don't you go first? Tackle as many as you can, especially the ones that were really directed at you.
Right. So I think the first question was about what if Trump doesn't leave, right? And honestly, I don't know what the law is when it comes to, you know, dragging an unwilling president out of the Oval Office. I'm not sure what it is there. I think that's where it's really going to come down to, if we're looking at that, right? And who knows what might happen between, assuming that Biden does, you know, that the counting goes his way, and between now and January 20th. That's where the informal power of the party probably becomes a lot more important, right? So if you find that the rest of the Republican Party start to say, you know, it's time for you to go, we have to acknowledge the process, that sort of thing. And Mitch McConnell had, you know, he when Trump previously had said that he might dispute the election results, and we'd have to see. He did come out and say that there would be a transfer of power. I don't remember his precise words, but so that's going to depend on the party, I think, for the most part. So I you know, but in terms of whether there's actually a legal mechanism, you know, I don't know what it is precisely. I think it's just that it's always been this way, and we've never had this problem usually. The other, so Chris asked about, I'll just do this quickly and then give the others a chance, but Chris asked about how, if all you cared about was winning, what's the most Machiavellian thing you can do? I guess that depends on, you know, whether you do just want to say, you know, like, I mean, we're talking about Trump here, so are we talking about just like sowing violence and as much doubt in the process as possible, or are we talking about just doing it legally, right? I imagine it's the former. So if we're talking about just, you know, sowing as much doubt into the process as possible, then maybe stirring things up a little bit, causing violence. I don't know how that ultimately gets him the White House for another 4 years, but maybe my imagination's not as vast on that front as my fellow panelists. So I don't, you know, I'm not sure what he can do, right? I think that a lot of legal experts are saying right now that if he really thought there was voter fraud, or he thought there was potential for voter fraud, he should have been filing lawsuits prior to Tuesday. And they did file a fair number, but most of them were turned down. And you had the one that I mentioned in Pennsylvania, but it's not clear that that's going to, you know, even if they wrap Pennsylvania on the knuckles for it, it's probably not going to result in any votes getting tossed. That would be very surprising, especially given that they effectively held up the 3-day extension before. So, I mean, I saw that he's appointed somebody as his somebody as his ballots team person, right? And you know, so that they're going to go out and see what kind of legal arguments they can come up with. I don't know what those are at this point, but we'll have to see. So I don't have a really good answer to that question. I'm not sure what he can do at this point that he hasn't tried already. I mean, the few lawsuits he has brought have been kind of gone out with a whimper. And then one other quick question, and then I'll let the others come in. It's just that, so with the presidential commission, I did see that if there's a dispute about electors, then I think there can be an outcome where electors aren't, for a particular state, or I don't remember how this worked, but like there is an outcome where the U.S. House of Representatives ends up picking the president if you have some spectacular failure with the Electoral College. But I think a lot of things have to go wrong before you ever get to that point, like a lot of things. We did have I don't remember if it was a tie, the election of maybe, I don't know if anyone else on the panel would know, but the election of 1876, I remember who it was, but I don't remember exactly what happened. It was Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. They did appoint a commission to decide who won that, because I think they either tied on the number of electoral votes or there was some other dispute. But that was a deeply polarizing election as well. So there is some precedent for this, but for an electoral commission, but not very much.
My mic's still unmuted. I think it goes to the House if there's not over 270. So you have to have a majority. So if the decisive state didn't show up, then it goes to the House, and they have the choice of the top 3. I think that's wrote down somewhere.
Right. Okay. I'll take your word for that on Chris.
Consuelo.
Great. So I'll get at the question about that, whether this, well, it was more of a statement, but I would disagree with the assessment that it was a disaster of an election for the Democratic Party. And the reason, and the ideological supremacy question. So first of all, I would say that the Democratic Party is a particularly big tent. It's one of those parties that just really has a really big ideological continuum. So it has, leftists who would never vote for Republicans, and then it has centrists and people who are even right now disaffected by the Republican Party because of Trumpism. So it's particularly big now as a tent as well. So I would say that given that, it's going to be very contentious, the primaries, and you're going to have people on the left and you're going to have people more on the center, and it's going to be that type of fight every time. I will say that it seemed like the person asking the question was getting at this, maybe the possibility that the party should be more open to the left wing because they might have more energy and things like this. I would say that the results from the election don't show that could bear out, that could actually be productive for a presidential election for the Democratic Party. I understand the appeal, for example, of Bernie Sanders, given the grassroots organizing, incredible grassroots organizing that he has, which is very important to win elections. But the ability that the right has to just portray those people as communists and socialists is just so powerful in this country. That I don't think that it could work. I mean, it's not something that I think, it's not about matching my ideology personally. I'm just saying that seems to be where the country is, and this big coalition that the Democrats need to win, which includes Latinos and African Americans and white and some white voters, especially women and suburbs, is just a coalition that is big, and it's not clear that that going to the left will help that. They might evolve, but right now it doesn't seem clear that, like, for example, if a Bernie Sanders had been the candidate, we would have had a landslide. That's not clear to me at all. So that would be my answer.
Gina.
Okay, thank you for these questions. I'll tackle a few of them quickly. First, I did want to jump in on the Machiavellian question because why not? And if there's one thing that spending a year to a year and a half out in the world of politics taught me, it's that politics is about one thing. It's about power. It's not about being right. It's not about not being a hypocrite. It's not about having the best fact-based argument in a situation. Like, it's just about power. And that's totally depressing. And it's why I'm back to academic political science now rather than politics. But that makes me, and maybe that's why I'm a little cynical about how this plays out with Trump, but I don't think my cynicism is unwarranted. So absolute most Machiavellian things Trump could be doing. I would just say make himself a victim at every turn. So, from weirdly, some of the research I've done on Central America and Central American history, it leads me to believe that when potentially violent leaders and populists have actually resorted to violence, and when their supporters have engaged in mass violence, it has backfired against them in terms of their political popularity sometimes. But the thing that works, is just making oneself the victim. And so again, I don't even want to give advice to Trump world, but if I were, and if Trump's long game is at this point to stay politically relevant, to stay politically powerful, possibly mount that new campaign, or at least, build this movement that we've been talking about that will then be powerful in determining future nominees for different offices and things. I think that doing everything possible to create situations where institutions, or the law or others come and crack down on him, and then publicizing those losses just over and over and over again, and creating, again, the sense that he's the victim is probably what he would do. And I actually think that if it came to it, and if, the Biden administration actually had federal marshals removing him from the White House or something like that, I think it would benefit him politically. Dear God, imagine the imagery, imagine the video loop playing, at every MAGA rally ever in the future of Trump being escorted out of the White House. I think it would actually be to his political benefit to not react violently and to not resort to violence, but to not to appear to go willingly either, and to appear to make these, make the state make him do this, so that he can then seem like the victim. So we'll see. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I do think he's laying the groundwork for that as a potential strategy of just continued victimization. In terms of the Democratic Party, so, was this like a huge crushing blue landslide? No, it wasn't. Was it an absolute catastrophe for the Democrats? I don't think it was either. I mean, again, I think there were several key states that were identified where the Democrats needed to find a way to pick up 10 to 50,000 more votes in this election. And it looks like they did that fairly successfully. And I do think that there should be some soul searching, though, about the way money is raised and spent. I mean, I have a ton of criticisms of the Democratic Party. If you would ever like to talk internal criticism of the Democratic Party, give me a call. I think that the role of money, the fact that you basically have to be a very wealthy person to be a candidate, and then, fundraising takes an enormous amount of candidates' time, and fundraising is used to determine how viable candidates are. I mean, it's very disturbing. And one thing we saw in this election is that perhaps having this overwhelming financial advantage is not quite as necessary as Democrats thought that it was. I think reevaluating the way money is spent. Yeah, I see Christine noting that $1 billion was spent, or 14 billion, right? But there are some things that were done that I think may have been quite successful. So the grassroots organizing long-term, really investing there. I mean, I think that Stacey Abrams will be hailed as a hero and a visionary, and who knows, becomes the chair of the DNC, becomes something else important as a result of this, which I think would be very positive, because, I think to me, it's fine that the Democratic Party has internal disagreements and is a very big tent. But I think the one thing that all Democrats would probably agree on at this point is that grassroots organizing is really key, and that it's really important to be doing that organizing work at the local level everywhere. Because you never know when an area is going to become more competitive. People didn't necessarily know that Arizona would be so critical. I mean, some people did, but and so really having that long game and doing that organizing work everywhere, means that you're sort of as well positioned as possible for these elections. And just to give an example, I mean, there were some areas where I think this is starting to pay off and to make some real changes. So like the region of California that I'm from, my home county, voted for Trump by 12 points in 2016 and voted for Biden by 3 or 4 this time. So it's an enormous shift. It's the first time that county has ever voted for a Democratic presidential candidate ever. They didn't even vote for Obama. And there's been a lot of organizing work that's been done there. And, I think that's a path forward. And then real quickly about the Republicans and institutions, and does Trump really need Republican support going forward, especially given that he has Twitter? For communications purposes, I don't think he really needs the party. And that's actually not how he reaches people. And in fact, it's possible that Donald Trump and the Trump campaign may have better data and better contact information for more people than the Republican Party. I mean, they certainly have their own data operation that's very extensive and is a huge asset for him going forward. But what I do think is concerning is, I think that there was a scenario in which Republican elites would have really denounced Trump and moved away from him if he had lost badly in this election. And what that would have done, it would have made him just less politically powerful and relevant in the future. And instead, he really has, I think, the potential to be sort of a kingmaker or a candidate himself again in the Republican Party. Because, the thing, I'd love to know Tereza's thoughts about this, but one of my kind of instincts is that, one way to draw people's attention away from Trump might be to give them something better, present them with a better alternative, a better candidate who's going to speak for them. And then they could refocus their energies on someone else. And that's the thing that I have trouble seeing now that Trump has done fairly well, is that I struggle to see how another Republican Party figure eclipses him. For example, who could you envision winning the 2024 Republican primary if not Donald Trump or his chosen successor? It's hard, right? It's hard to think of that. And, so that's why I think that the Republican leadership, if things had gone differently, it could have played a role in kind of keeping him out of actual political power. But I think he's going to remain quite politically powerful in the future because he did have a fairly good electoral performance.
Yeah, Gina, you and I made comparisons to Latin American strongmen who continue to live on after they have departed office. So I think Uribe was one of the ones that I had mentioned. And I was thinking, you can have quite a powerful political presence after even being shamed out of office. So part 2, who knows what's coming next? And just on that point around who knows when a place will, a particular area or county or district might become viable, right? And I worked on the Kerry campaign in 2004, and I remember we were trying to set up these meetup groups in Georgia, and the party just did not care, right? Like they just did not care. They're waste of resources. Why are you even bothering talking to people? And there was absolutely no sense that there was any point in doing anything in places that were not swing states at all. No effort whatsoever, because it was just money down the drain. And I think, you know, Bernie Sanders and Stacey Abrams now have really started to change what that looks like, and AOC and so forth, right? There's a whole movement of people that are approaching politics very differently, and partly I think in response to what happened with Trump in 2016, that all of these women have come out of the woodwork and then did really well in the midterms, right? So there could be the backlash to the backlash to the backlash coming. Who knows what that looks like?
So just to say really quickly, I just really fast wanted to agree with you completely. And, you know, just wanted to say that, I mean, if we wonder how did Obama do so well so many places, you know, a lot of people think that it was the 50-state strategy. I mean, there are these two beliefs within the Democratic Party. There's the 50-state strategy, which is like Howard Dean, Barack Obama. And then there's the hyper-targeted swing district people. And I'm obviously a 50-state strategy person, but one of the reasons behind that, I think, is that you have to really believe the polling. If you're going to only invest in certain places, your polling had better be like, you know, God level correct. And we know that it's not. So your chances of making a mistake are fairly high. And also that people and circumstances are just inherently unpredictable. You know, you never know when an incumbent is going to suddenly leave office in a scandal, or something is going to suddenly happen. Or, you know, I mean, in the case of my region, like people will start moving there from other parts of the state and then change its composition quickly. So, you know, but I completely agree with you, Christine, that it's been very hard historically to get Democratic Party attention to these places that are viewed as uncompetitive. Like, I mean, I went all the way to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with the DCCC at one point, and then couldn't get in the building because our district was just viewed as so uncompetitive. I mean, I could never hire a properly trained finance director ever for my campaign, despite having the money on hand to hire this person, because we just couldn't recruit them away from, like, quote unquote, more competitive locations that seemed juicier and easier to win. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that rather than having a big ideological fight and trying to impose a single ideology on the entire Democratic Party, I think that accepting a range of views, but saying that we have a shared commitment to grassroots organizing would be an excellent strategy going forward.
Tereza, you can pick up wherever it is that you want on whatever it is that you found interesting.
Anything. Anything. I'll start with Regina's question. I think that's a good place to start, because that grounds us on some of the things that we've been talking about. I think it will. So, okay. So the whole populism thing, I tried to get away with it. You didn't let me. You're putting me back in. Let me tell you what I think. Populism is a very interesting concept. It helps us a lot to understand political party narratives, right? And whether they're ideological or they rely on the key narrative, the will of the people and the anti-establishment, right? These are the two key things that determine whether a leader is a populist. However, when you take this and you translate it to political psychology and you try to understand public opinion, we use a very stupid scale that basically asks people, would you vote for a populist party? And that makes you a populist supporter, but that tells us nothing. Absolutely nothing about the psychology of these voters. And the voters are not populists, the leaders are, the parties can be. So the psychology of the voter is very, very different. We need to engage with that. So some of the work that Christine at the very, very beginning mentioned, my work on political reactionism, looks at that, looks at exactly the psychological elements, characteristics, motivations, emotions, and thoughts that constitute the what I call the reactionary orientation, which is an orientation that seems to go for that kind of leadership. But it might seem a little bit like nitpicking, but it's not really, because it is important for us to think, what are the psychological characteristics of the voters that make them be attracted to these kind of messages? So in my work, I find, for instance, that there's a couple of things, but if you look at the preferences, they are consistently anti. These people do not have ideological preferences. They are not on the left, they're not on the right. I wanted to start by talking with the metaphor of the tent that Consuelo brought in, which is useful because the Republican Party is also a very big tent. And we used to have independents that would stand outside the tents, but now we kind of forgotten this and we split America again in half. There are independents who don't have allegiances to a particular party, but they would vote for Trump. So what are they? What are they, right? They are not ideological Republicans. They are not populist in any way because they don't have affiliation to political parties, but they are attracted to this kind of message. So I would call them reactionaries. They are the anti-people, the people who don't have a vision forward, but they like to oppose. It's easy to oppose. It's very palatable to go against something than to find a way through towards something. Reactionism is non-ideological. It has more to do with attraction to tradition, aversion to change, which happens to correlate with the Conservative Party, but it's not conservative because conservatives like to preserve the present, whereas reactionaries want to take things back. Anyway, that's a whole different roundtable for us to talk about. But what happens then? You ask the question, what attracts people to him? Right. So I think there is certain emotional elements, the resentful emotions that these people have that are being fed, right? And the anti-preferences that they have been offered. And there is also psychological mechanisms of transvaluation, scapegoating other people that also are provided to them. So what would take people away? Somebody who does that more. And I'm not sure this is a positive thing, right? If you find the Trump on steroids, a kind of leader that keeps feeding the needs of these people even more than Trump, that will push Trump aside. And we have seen this in other countries. We see this all the time. Somebody comes who gives you more of what you need, the old goes, yeah, and long live the new king. But there's another way out of it. And I think we need to resist the downward spiral because it's tempting. It's sensational for us to keep talking about the negative stuff, but we can see a way out of this because citizens also, we see the swings in politics. When things move towards one way on an aggregate, then you can swing things back a little bit too. So you focus on what people need, right? You educate them, you engage with their needs. If people are reactionaries, if people are deeply resentful of politics, they're experiencing that for a reason. It's not because they're stupid or they are bad people. They have grievances that have not been addressed. They have voices that have not been heard. They have needs that have not been met. They have education needs that have not been met. People being trained in our tradition in academia to follow science, the scientific thinking, looking for evidence to disprove a point, scanning the environment broadly is very, very different to the standard way people operate when they do their selective exposure. They go for things they like, or they settle for things that are easy. So we need education on that. We need education on scientific thinking. You don't search for things that prove your point, but you try to engage with information to find evidence that disproves your point, and that we're all comfortable with that, but not many people are. So I think this is where we need to be investing. If you invest in your electorate, better electorates give you better leaders. If you leave your electorates to roam, the needs, their frustrations, their pain is going to come around to bite you. And we have seen this. There are people who have been neglected. The whole South has been ignored for years, decades. So there is an important thing there. So if you don't want many people under the tent, you have to stop the rain, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I realize that we are now at 8:38. I think there are some children to put to bed in various households. I don't know, Colin and Tereza in particular, I think, could one of you stay on?
We can carry on. Let's carry on.
Can you? Okay. So for those of you who need to leave, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those of you, and I know that a number of you do have questions, and if you want to have them answered, I will call you in turn. And to everybody else, have a good night. But I'm gonna let folks ask their questions. So I've got Eduardo, and then I've got Mark, and then Sally, and then Gregory, and then Duncan, and then Bence, and then we'll call it a night after that. And then not everything will be answered. So I think I'll just leave people to answer selectively as they want. Okay, so Eduardo, would you like to start us off?
So I'm bringing back the populist label.
Oh, could you speak up a bit? Because I think we can't hear you very well. So maybe come closer to your mic. And of course, try to keep your question brief. That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you. So do you think whether or not the probable Trump defeat as a populist leader would somehow affect the populist wave Europe is experiencing or has been experienced for the last couple of years? Thank you.
So ramifications for Europe, maybe Tereza or Colin? Possibly. Okay. Mark.
Yeah. So a lot of people say that jailing your political rivals after they leave office is a bad idea because it sets a bad precedent. I would argue that the precedent's already been set in 2016 Trump rallies. They're always saying lock up Hillary. They're trying to lock up Joe Biden. The only reason they're not doing it is because they didn't actually commit any crimes. And furthermore, I think by not taking action in this case, basically sets a precedent that the president actually is above the law. Like, obviously, you don't jail them for jaywalking, but if you just let them commit any crime they want and never, that seems almost worse than reinforcing a precedent that's honestly already been set. So I'm very curious to hear what you guys all think about it.
And we didn't even talk about impeachment today. We've got Sally.
Hi, Christine, and thank you very much, panelists. This has been amazing and just really nice to hear some rational people. My question is, to what extent do you think we can draw a direct line between the Black Lives Matter campaign and the increased voter turnout on both sides, or can we ever know?
Thanks, Sally. Gregory.
Oh, sorry, just went away for a second. So it was said by one member of the panel that they thought that Donald Trump, because of his rather better than expected performance, is unlikely to leave politics. Is that really, is that a view shared by the other members of the panel? He's not going to go back to front another version of The Apprentice and make money that way. His love of money won't overtake his love of politics. And if he does decide to continue in politics, what about the situation pre-January? I'm not actually aware of what he can do with regard to executive orders. Could he might say justifiably, create statehood for Puerto Rico, so it's no longer a Commonwealth thing, so we can have another Supreme Court judge from there, and Washington as well, which is wanting to become a state. Could he do that, or at least get it in motion prior to January, so we can have two nice new conservative judges sitting on the Supreme Court, so that there's even better possibility that Roe v. Wade will be overturned? Or could he in fact so speed it up that they are in place before January and might be able to be on the court where any of his challenges to the elections be successful and then work their way through the state court to the Supreme Court? Does he have the power to do that? I'm not quite sure of his powers. And if those things are not possible before January, might he still become active in a way of helping to engender cases being brought at state levels with regard to such issues as abortion and homosexuality and all the other issues that he's made himself popular with regard to the religious right, so that they find their way through to the Supreme Court? So to make sure that he's taking advantage, fully advantage of the Republican majority in the Senate, if that still holds, and the majority on the court, so that the Democrats would be forced to behave in the same way as Trump and create masses more judges if they were not to actually find so many things reversed. What's the panel's views?
Thank you, Gregory. I think actually, you know what, that one will be, I think, relatively easy to deal with, despite the the fact that there was a lot in there, because I think that was just a really factual question. So we've got Duncan and then Bence.
Thank you all, and especially Christine for organizing this. I was really grateful for Tereza's account of the Trump voters, who, there are nearly 70 million of them. He'd be nothing without them. We really got to understand these people as best we can. And so my question was, how many of those you think he could turn out onto the streets, and with what consequence?
Thank you, Duncan. Bence?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the panel. From outside the US, as I am scanning the different news and Twitter channels, it seems that the US is perceived more and more dysfunctional and with a huge democratic deficit. Maybe it is just a perception, but for instance, in South Korea 2 days ago, one of the trending comments was that the US presidential election is too important to only let Americans vote. And also in Europe, more and more politicians and experts are saying that if we have to wait for a couple of thousand votes in Georgia or in Pennsylvania every 4 years, and it decides the strategic direction of the US, we cannot really rely on the US as a strategic partner in the future. So how could the US repair this thing domestically, this international image problem, because it's a domestic issue? The US should be the beacon of democracy, but now it seems that other developed democracies are having more and more doubts about the future of the US. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big one, and we've got hopefully at least the next 4 years to figure that one out. There's also a question here from Henry who I've missed out on, but I'll just read it out so that in case anybody wants to tackle it. So the US isn't a post-conflict society, but would it benefit from national reconciliation efforts, or is that a step too far? And I think that's actually a really helpful way to frame this conversation. In fact, I put out a tweet earlier on today talking about reconciliation, right? And just at this moment that we should just all be a bit careful in terms of our language, that it might, for those of you who are Biden supporters, it's a moment of jubilation. But for those of you who aren't, this is a moment of pain and loss and grief, and should be treated as such. And it's without that kind of empathy for people who are going through something very different, we could end up in a very ugly place. So just, I think for ourselves and for how we're talking about this and talking to each other and celebrating in a lot of cases, or being very angry in others, that it's just a very emotional time for a lot of people. And I remember how it felt in 2016. It was very painful. So think about that again when you're thinking about your reactions and how you respond to other people in the next few days. Lockdown in the UK is not helping things either, right? So the coronavirus will make all of your emotions even more heightened. And just to think about those tensions and taking them out onto the streets and what that looks like when Gina was talking about the warm weather and all the rest, right? So we're adding another layer of tension and difficulty on top of an already difficult time. So I am so tempted to answer that Machiavellian question, but I'm just not going to do that. I really want to tell you guys how I would be if I was Donald Trump and tell you how I would take this election, but I'm not going to do that. So let me pass this back to, let me start with Tereza in this case, and then we'll go backwards from there.
Great questions. Thank you. I've made a list, so I'm going to go through the list quickly, because if we can go on, I think we need another roundtable, Christine. Maybe we'll do this a Friday thing. Anyway, okay, populism wave in Europe. What happens? How is this going to play out? Yes, there's a big populism wave in Europe and in other places around the world. You could look at India. We don't need to go through the long list. It has to do with the capacity, with the needs of people and how they have been met or not met or ignored by their political system and the political elites. And these are emotional needs, there's a pragmatic needs, there are ways of thinking as well. So it's a tripartite thing. You cannot just tackle one of them. You have to make sure you address emotions and issues, concerns, and the way of thinking, the way people have been making sense of the world. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but in terms of what was the other one? What's going to happen if people go out in the streets? Who are these people who might actually go? Okay, this is a fantastic question. We have ways to study the electorate, voters, and try to understand who are the people who are most likely to engage in violence. And actually, in some of the work that I do, we started looking at radical political behavior and engagement to violence, anomic behavior. And we found that reactionary people with reactionary orientations are very likely not to go out and break stuff, but actually dormantly support others who do. So what you usually see is that this passive support for violence, but reactionaries, if the people that we're talking about have the characteristics of reactionaries and are Trump voters, because they have low sense of efficacy, they're not going to go en masse out and break out stuff. There might be a few in small numbers that have high sense of efficacy, very high resentment, and they go out and break. These are the people that are likely to mobilize to action. But the ones who are feeling what we call resentment, that's a passive toxic resentment that also comes with low efficacy, they're unlikely to go. So I wouldn't expect mass movements, but you might see some instigation of violence. So people who feel particularly strengthened, or they feel they've been given a voice and they have nothing to lose. So I think, you know, engaging with that and trying to manage that psychologically is going to be very, very interesting in the upcoming days. Now, in terms of empathy, I think Christine put it very, very wisely. We need to be sensitive to what's going on. Many of us are going to get cocky in the upcoming days. Many of us might get really, really sad and experience loss, traumatic loss, and some others might get really, really cocky. And both these things are not good. They're not healthy responses. So Winnicott talked about what it's called the capacity for concern. And capacity for concern for the other. So when you are in a winning position, you care about the pain of the other human being. That's a step towards the right direction. So if we can all bring ourselves to that space and show our capacity for concern, will be a very, very positive, small step we can take. The problem is that people who are traumatized or people who are deeply in narcissism don't have capacity for concern. So you might not receive it back, but if you're able to give it, that's a good step. It makes the world a happier place among those who can give it. At least we can keep holding hands. Maybe I'll stop, because I think there's so much more to say, but I can come back to more later. Yeah.
Consuelo.
Great. So those are some great questions that I'd like to respond to. So first off, the one about the jailing the political rivals, whether it's a bad idea, whether they would do that. So my take on this one, it's a really difficult question. I wouldn't want to be Biden for many reasons. But one, I would say that the best way to go with this is to just leave it to the Justice Department. And it's not something, obviously as a president, you appoint people in the Justice Department, but it's not kind of a decision that the president takes. And so that separation is helpful. On the other hand, I agree with the victimization argument that Gina is making. So the more you victimize Trump, the more political power he has from his base. The one thing that I would do, though, as president, if I were Biden, is to change that provision, which is not even a law, but it's a provision that during the impeachment process they used to not prosecute Trump, which is that presidents cannot be prosecuted, or there's a specific word that they use. I forgot what it is. But basically, you can't. They weren't able to say that you're guilty because they couldn't prosecute him. It was just really with a weird language that they had to use in the impeachment process. I think that's something that's, I would just get rid of that provision or make it more explicit that it is possible, so that no president is above the law. And that way you don't have to wait until post-elections, and then those difficulties emerge. On the Black Lives Matter, I do think that yes, 100%, the Black Lives Matter movement, and more generally movements on the left, the Women's March and all these things, helped immensely the turnout. Just that is all the grassroots organizing that they've been doing. I mean, I agree 100% with Gina that the way forward with the Democratic Party is grassroots organizing, and it's always been. So we also have studies in political science that show that where you have protests prior to an election, you have higher turnout. So just people are very engaged. This on the whether Trump. So I actually disagree a little bit with Gina with just her being kind of certain that Trump will continue running and doing these things. I think he's going to go. I mean, I actually don't know what he's going to do because he's erratic, and in some ways he is very predictable. But I just don't really know what he's going to do. But another option I see, and I see them as maybe equally likely, is that he just goes off to a really well-paying TV show. He is so good at political attention, at just attention on TV, and he enjoys it as a narcissist. I agree 100% with Tereza that he's a narcissist, and that he might just use that. I will say that he might continue in politics. I see it as only if it is the way forward without to avoid prosecution. Like if he sees that he might actually go to jail, he might actually be prosecuted, I would say that for personal interest reasons, he might still be in politics to be able to influence that process. Tereza wants to have a two-finger, and I'll continue. Yeah, please. Oh, you're muted.
I didn't mean to stop you. I mean,
I
want you to jump in afterwards.
This is great. Okay.
Okay. Very well. Yeah. On this, I think Nico Frida told us about the law of apparent reality. That very often when we go away from reality, we react to reality. No, we react to things that could be real rather than what is real. What I would urge us to do in the upcoming days is put that aside. Stop sensationalizing. Don't think about Trump. Don't think about what he could do. It doesn't care. It doesn't matter what he could do if it seems likely that he would do that, because that's not the reality. I think we need to keep our feet on the ground. And because the law of apparent reality is very sensational, we react to things that we think are likely to happen, or no, we think that are potentially feasible. So we start making scenarios and we go with that, and then we react emotionally to these scenarios, and we lose track of where we are at the here and now. I think it is really, really important for all of us to stay at the here and now. What he will do a month from now, 3 years from now, is irrelevant for now. So we could make our life much, much simpler if you push the apparent reality away and stick with the real reality, which is all we've got, really. That's all I wanted to say, and I'm going to be quiet now.
No, that's great. I like the discussion. I mean, I will say that I slightly disagree with you on that, just because I think we need to prepare if we need to protect democracy. I think we need to be prepared for what to do, because that would take civil resistance. It'll take organized responses from the population. And the more organized they are, the more well thought out they are, the more nonviolent they will be, and the less likely that will turn into violence. I gave the example last Friday of Maria Stefan, who is working at USIP, but she stepped out for 6 months to do this kind of work of democracy protection and training federal officers, civil servants on civil resistance and how to respond. I think that that's important, even though it does respond to kind of like the worst case scenario of like Trump not conceding. I think we benefit from just thinking of those options and definitely not reacting to them if they don't occur. And actually, I was so happy to see that like election day was peaceful and that we haven't had to go out to the streets, because I'm prepared to go out to the streets if I see some shenanigans in the electoral counting and things like this. But so I think both things, are true. So lastly, what would Trump do in the next 2 months? That's actually what I said in my remarks that I think I'm most concerned about, because I don't have the Machiavellian mind and the way to. I don't know how he can stack things up. I don't know the full kind of extent of laws. I agree with what we've said before, which is that he tends to be restrained by laws in this country, fortunately, but norms are just like out the window. So anything that is remotely norm related, you can assume he can just completely get rid of. And so I would say if it helps him to pardon himself, he will. On the Supreme Court mention, I didn't quite understand how that would work, because it's not like with Puerto Rico there would be another Supreme Court person, but I'm not an expert on this, but that's not something I've ever heard. And then you know, voter suppression, things that he could do to make it even worse for the future could happen if it's norm related, which a lot of things are, and we've realized that they are. Just one last quick thing on grievances. So I agree with Tereza, and that's actually the kind of the thing that came out of the 2016 election. We need to pay attention to the poor white voters, uneducated people, rural areas, opioid crisis. I mean, these kinds of people, right? And I completely agree with you. On the other hand, it's so puzzling to me that people who are hurting a lot and have been hurting for much longer, African Americans, don't have the opposite populist on their side. You know, the way that African Americans have organized for various reasons, historically, contingent on civil rights movement, the incredible effect of the leadership of the Catholic Church and Protestant Church. I think there's a lot of reasons why it's not parallel, but to me, like, grievances don't necessarily have to lead to this kind of thing, the populism. But yeah, it's interesting to think about under what conditions you'll get kind of this response and not others. That's it.
Oh, this could go on. So many. You're opening up a new Pandora's box set of questions that we could go into. But
sorry,
yeah, Gina.
Can I?
Oh, actually, no, I think because we're going to run out of time, I'm going to just pass it on to Gina.
I just wanted to clarify what Consuelo said with regard to if more Supreme Court judges, there's no constraint on the numbers which can be created, apparently. So were he to try to create as many as he felt he could get away with before January, whether or not it would be conceivably possible to have them.
Colin might be able to answer that.
So that they would be helpful with regard to the election challenges and, of course, at least into the future.
The first thing is that no Republican has any desire whatsoever to make Puerto Rico and DC states. That's something they've gone on. This is actually something they've said that the Democrats are going to do, and they kind of successfully employed that during this election. As well as the court packing thing, right? So as Gina was pointing out, it's all about power, right? So forget about the norm shredding with regard to Merrick Garland not getting his seat in 2016 and Amy Coney Barrett getting hers now. Tom Tillis may have kept his seat in North Carolina because he said Democrats are going to pack the court, right? When there's no evidence that his opponent or any other Democrat has said that. Joe Biden has not embraced that idea. So that's the first thing, is that they really have they know that that's basically 4 Senate seats that are going to go Democrat pretty much every time. But even if that was to happen and he got it done in 2.5 months, which is impossible, they still have to have a separate long-winded discussion about adding Supreme Court seats, because that's something that it's not, you don't just get more seats as a result of having more representation in certain areas. So. But the premise from the beginning is that they wouldn't want to do that, and Trump could never do it himself. He would, he needs Congress to do those things. You definitely can't do that through executive order.
Thanks, Colin. Did you want to finish with maybe the rest of your questions, and then I'll turn it over to Gina?
Yeah, sure. If that's okay, I'll be selective about some of these questions. So. Let's see, what was I going to say? So one thing about pardoning himself, right? About what Trump's going to do, he cannot pardon himself from the one thing that he really has to be concerned with, right? Like there's been a lot of legal action. It's really hard to keep track of all the legal actions that have been brought against him and his administration, and what's been brought against him or his administration. But the one that he really has to worry about is the New York District Attorney investigation into his financial records, as well as the hush money that he paid to Stormy Daniels to cover up his affair because he used campaign finance money, and that got Michael Cohen and all that trouble, and it goes on beyond that. It involves a lot of fraud potentially, fraud, I believe, in the criminal sense, not in the civil sense. So that is the one area where he might be looking at if that was to go far enough, he could be looking at jail time. Now, so he cannot pardon himself from that. He can pardon himself from potential federal crimes that he committed, but he's not on the hook for any federal crimes that I know of right now. So, but the thing that he's good at, and that we're going to see potentially now in the next few weeks, is that he will just keep suing and keep defending in court, and he's all about delay, right? He's not about winning the argument on the merits, right? He so doesn't care about that. It's just about bringing down his opponent and delaying and delaying and delaying because he's got the resources to infinitely do that. So in a way, jail time might just be a distant prospect that doesn't really come to pass because he's good at just continually suing. And the Supreme Court earlier this year basically just bought him time when they said that, yes, the New York DA can see your financial records, but we're going to send it back to the New York District Court anyway one more time. And so it had one more round to go through and all that. So that's one thing on that. I would just, on the broader theme of kind of reconciliation, and I've read Tereza's article, which is excellent, and the idea of finding some sort of healing is really important. And I think it's possible in one way, in that voters are not as extreme as the politicians that represent us, I think you could say, right? Like each party is probably, maybe not as much with the Democrats, but with the Republicans, that the average elected Republican tends to be further right of the average Republican voter, from what I understand. But so, there's room for optimism, but there was also room for optimism in 2008. Right, and you can ask Barack Obama how well this went, and with what he had a unified Congress, and he had all those kind of socialism claims because he was able to accomplish healthcare, and he was so focused on this that he wasn't really focused enough on the message, and then he faced this blowout loss in 2010 where they lost the House. Now, if Joe Biden's elected, right, it's looking probable, not definite, but probable that he's going to face a Republican Senate. Now, Mitch McConnell is not really somebody who reaches across the aisle. He has shown pretty much zero ability or willingness to do that, right? And even the areas where people will point and say, oh, well, the Democrats blew up the filibuster in 2013, you can find research that says, actually, that was Mitch McConnell's fault as well, because at the time there were 3 DC Circuit appellate court seats that were up to be filled, and Mitch McConnell came to Harry Reid and said, we're not going to let you fill these, right? And so Harry Reid said, well, I guess the only choice I have is to get rid of the filibuster in that case if we're going to go ahead and fill these seats. So if I were Mitch McConnell, here's where I can be Machiavellian better than Trump, because I can think of his mind a little bit better. But the Affordable Care Act, right, is going before the Supreme Court in 4 days again, right? We're going to hear arguments on this case again because of changes that Republicans made to it in the 2017 tax bill, where they altered the nature of basically the part of the bill that says you have to have health insurance, right? Now, I looked at this a couple of weeks ago. Like a week ago, I was in another panel discussion where I was echoing what other legal scholars had said, which is that, well, that's not a problem. If Biden has a Democratic Senate as well, they'll go in, they'll tinker with the tax bill legislation, they'll change the individual mandate and basically render this legal challenge moot. If the Republicans hold on to the Senate, he doesn't have that option, right? And he's much more dependent on what are these 9 judges going to do. Now, they might decide not to strike down the law entirely. There's a legal alternative to them called severability, where they can just sever away this part, the individual mandate, and keep the rest of the law. That would seem to be like the least disruptive from a policymaking point of view way to go. And that's what John Roberts would want to do, the Chief Justice, but he's no longer the median justice. He's one of the liberal guys now, right? He's like the 4th liberal justice, even though he's very conservative, George W. Bush appointee. So it's possible that Mitch McConnell is looking at this and thinking, wow, this law might get struck down while Joe Biden's president, and we can pin it all on them, which we know the Republican Party will have no problem doing, right? They will absolutely blame him completely, even though he's part of the administration that brought that law about in the first place. So, and that's going to then, if that happens, then it's going to lay the groundwork much more easily for the Republicans possibly taking the House back as well in 2022, which is going to lead to more gridlock, which is then going to, and all the while create more polarization and lead us back to, oh, what happened to that reconciliation thing? So that's my cynical take on that, right? I'd like to think that reconciliation and the ability to bridge, at least among voters, will be good. But what's going to actually happen, I think, between the president and the Senate is potentially going to be ugly for the next couple of years, and is going to put people back in their camps to a large extent. So I'm sorry that I'm going to leave on that. I'm going to finish on that note. But that's kind of the policy making reality, right? of what I think might happen. And forget about Biden's infrastructure and climate plans as well. He's going to have to do things in a more executive, right, rulemaking, executive order sort of way, which is what Barack Obama had to do between 2010 and 2016. I'll stop now.
Thanks, Colin. And for those who aren't paying super close attention, the Senate is actually still undecided. Control of the Senate is going to be determined in January after the Georgia runoff, because there's the senators actually have to get over 50% in order to be elected, and neither of them, it looks like, are going to do that. So there will be a runoff in January in Georgia, and that's going to make things very, very interesting, especially if Georgia ends up in Biden's camp. So who knows what will happen in January. Gina, final words.
All right, well, very quickly, I mean, a lot has already been said here, so I'll just respond selectively to a few points. So on this question of jailing political rivals, so I wanted to clarify that obviously, I think it's important for normative reasons and for rule of law reasons that if neutral arbiters think that there is someone out there who has broken the law in a significant way, of course they should be investigated. Of course they should be prosecuted. When that person is a high-profile political figure, it seems like it would be wise to make sure that that effort was super transparent and ideally bipartisan, or had some other kind of checks around it. And it's useful to think through that. And as Consuelo has actually mentioned, I think that the communication around election results and vote counting and things has actually been quite good, and that there's been an effort to make sure that people highlight, there are Republican secretaries of state involved in this process right now. And, if there were seriously a prosecution of Trump, I mean, probably by state authorities, I would think going forward, it would seem important, just to really be very, very clear that it's not a politically motivated investigation, have a lot of transparency around it. But what I was saying was just that there's, I don't know, sometimes this optimistic chatter that I hear, especially from idealistic people who really believe in the rule of law, who think that if there were criminal charges filed against Trump, or that if Trump ended up in jail or something like that, that would spell the end of Trumpism in the US. And I just absolutely don't think so. I mean, there are plenty of examples from around the world and from within the US of people voting for convicted criminals, voting for people with serious charges being filed against them. Sometimes when a history of violence, a history of criminal activity is revealed, it can actually help some candidates that I've studied in other settings, because it makes them seem tough, or it sort of enhances their bravado. I mean, in the case of Trump being prosecuted, as I've mentioned, I think would enhance his sense of victimization and create new grievances for his supporters to then protest. So, so I'm not advocating that investigations that are merited shouldn't go forward. I'm just highlighting that there can be unexpected political consequences of those actions. That's something to keep in mind. Let's see here. In terms of money and politics and Trump, again, I agree with Tereza's suggestion to stay in the here and now, and we're awaiting remarks from Joe Biden later tonight. Vote counting is ongoing. I mean, there's a lot happening to focus on right now, and I certainly would not presume to know what lies ahead for Donald Trump. But I also agree with Consuelo that in terms of preparation and kind of thinking through scenarios, it's useful to consider to some extent what might come. Tereza says, no, don't do that. Maybe not for our mental health, but I think that there's also a risk that people think the election happened, it happened on Tuesday. Maybe there's some kind of announcement today. Next week, this all goes away. Next week, we wake up and it's over. And I think that's just very much not the case. And that would be very disappointing to think that and then have it not happen. But that said, of course, I have no idea what Donald Trump is really going to do. But it seems inevitable to me that he just has a ton of political assets. I mean, he has, this contact information for so many people. He has this whole operation. Either he uses it or someone else uses it because it's transferred to them in some way. I mean, this is not an asset that's just going to lie fallow and be abandoned. And who knows what form this takes. And I think that being a TV personality is not incompatible with being active in politics at the same time. And there's, again, interesting examples of that from around the world, people who sort of flip back and forth between both worlds with some frequency. So we'll see. But for today, we'll try to stay in the here and now. And then finally, in terms of sort of national reconciliation or trying to bring people together. You know, I mean, I found when I was involved in actual politics as a Democrat running in a historically Republican area, although maybe not entirely that way today. You know, the fact is that there's so much more that people have in common. And for most people, you know, how they vote in a particular election is just a little slice of who they are. And even, you know, the fact is that most people who voted in the US chose either Biden or Trump. But there's probably something that appeals to them about the other person, about the other candidate they didn't choose. And in many cases, you know, there might be 3 things they liked about someone and 7 things they don't like about them, right? But they voted based on those 3 things. So I think that, you know, of course, there's a lot of room for people to find common ground, and that's what we all do on a daily basis anyhow. You know, people work together on all sorts of community-based projects and neighborhood initiatives and, you know, and really have a lot of values and goals in common. But the thing I think is hard is that, like, I don't really see the way forward as lying entirely with individuals. I mean, I think, again, in our individual lives, people do pretty well on average dealing with people who have different views than them. I really see the kind of structural problem as institutional, and that institutional reform is what would be needed to you know, meet people's basic demands, have more effective policy making, you know, make sure that we don't have people going hungry in the richest country in the world and, you know, lacking basic health care, and I mean, having these very legitimate grievances. And yet the systems that we have in place, from gerrymandered districts to a whole bunch of other kind of structural factors, you know, lead to a lot of polarization at the level of decision makers. And, you know, so that's where I think that before emphasizing just sort of individual to individual reconciliation, I would probably emphasize institutional reform. You know, for example, having just truly independent, population-based districts drawn by demographers who are truly nonpartisan. I mean, things like that I think would go a long way, because then you would see more incentives for leaders to be elected who better, you know, reflect that spirit of conciliation and cooperation that exists in their communities anyhow.
Thanks so much, Gina. I'm feeling the need from from some of our panelists to go handle children. So I think we've lost either Tereza or Colin potentially as a result of that. Still here. I know, but I feel like you're going to switch off in a moment. So
can I jump in? Oh, Colin's back. Can I jump in very quickly about this?
No.
Okay.
Because I know you could go on, and I want to close this off just by first of all saying sorry to poor Batsby, whose question we didn't fully answer, but I feel like there's going to be round for another one. I mean, most of us are actually international relations scholars on this panel. So apologies for not actually answering the question relating to international dealing with international relations. I think we'll save that for another panel that I think will be worthwhile maybe in a month's time, addressing what does foreign policy look like under a new Biden presidency. And maybe we can get some folks who are part of that discussion coming to a panel here with us. And then I want to just go back to that question about, because I do have some feelings about this that I think we can learn from the comparative context that Mark asked, just about whether or not the president is above the law and should that president be prosecuted, and how to deal with that self-pardoning issue. And I think, you know, instructively from Civil War contexts, right, and especially in dealing with transitional justice issues, part of this is about timing. It's not just about a yes or no, it's about when. Right. And the when is super, super critical. If you do it at the wrong time, what ends up happening is you just destabilize the country. And if I were in Biden's shoes, if he does indeed end up becoming president, the question is not just one of whether or not this is the, you know, setting an example of a person. It's about destabilizing the entire country. Right. So that would be, in my mind, one of the foremost considerations. And I think it would be hopefully in the minds of those people who would be making the prosecutorial decisions as well, because it's never ever just about straight up black and white kind of rule of law issues. There is always in the background a political context, the Black Lives Matters movements, and who's mobilizing on the streets, and what is just happening at that moment, and what else could blow up around you, right? And this is just a very, very tense moment. So I think that issue doesn't, and just because he doesn't get prosecuted now doesn't mean that he won't be prosecuted 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And that has happened in a lot of transitional justice cases where, you know, leaders get prosecuted 20 or 30 or 40 years down the line, right? So this does not have to be dealt with right now. And then just, I have to answer that Machiavellian question, because I think there are so many interesting Machiavellian ways in which you could go about this, right? And I put one into the chat in answer to Mark's question, but it is about that, the dispute around who would end up, if you can argue that there is going to be a dispute around who would be those electors, then in going forward and dealing with the electoral college vote, that's one way to go about it. But I think more interestingly, Consuelo answered this question last week with the idea of the, you know, agents provocateurs who would go out and incite violence in particular cases and make it look like it was part of the left, right? So we've got Black Lives Matters protests going on at the same time as we've got all of this election stuff going on. And, you know, what better reason to bring out the National Guard or to invoke repression from that state, that kind of one-sided violence that Gina was talking about last week, than to provoke violence and to make the respondents on the left and Biden's supporters come out and defend that, and then to make it look a little bit chaotic. And into that chaos comes a reason then to impose whatever force you need. And all that's needed really is an excuse for force, right? So if I were to be that kind of Machiavellian about it, that's the way in which I would go about it. And you know, it doesn't have to be as well orchestrated as I think we're talking about. Like, a lot of this can really just come from individuals taking initiative and you know, listening to the words of Steve Bannon. If you listen to the kind of tone that he's using using the language of revolution here, and he's using the language of revolution in relation to the Declaration of Independence, right? Of fighting the Brits back, you know, way back when. It is the same kind of language of overthrowing the elite, and we should be careful of that kind of language and in the incitement to violence that comes out of you know, this particular moment. So, you know, just thank you so much to all of you for joining us for such a long period. I think it's been a really difficult conversation in some ways, but I think we've all learned a lot from it. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to all of you for amazing questions. For those of you who want, it'll go up on YouTube later. And have a good night. Stay safe for those of you who are in the US. And yeah, we'll wait to see the official results and what comes out of it.